There are places in the world where the past lingers like a cold breath on the back of your neck, where the walls themselves seem to remember every secret, every sorrow, every scream that was never heard. In the heart of rural Vermont, nestled between dense forests and rolling hills, there once stood such a place, a building whose very name was spoken in hushed tones by the locals, a place that cast a shadow longer than any sunset. They called it the Marrow House Orphanage, though in time it would be known by another name, the Orphanage of Shadows. It was built in 1872, at the height of America's orphan crisis, when the scars of the Civil War had left thousands of children, without families, wandering the streets of cities and towns, hungry, desperate, and invisible. The Marrow House was meant to be a sanctuary, a place where lost children could find shelter, food, and perhaps even a new family. But as the years passed, the stories that drifted out of those stone walls grew darker, stranger, and more difficult to ignore. The first thing you notice about the Marrow House, even in old photographs, is how out of place it looks. The architecture is severe, almost fortress-like, with narrow windows and a roof that seems to press down on the building as if trying to keep something inside. The grounds are overgrown, the trees twisted and gnarled, their branches reaching toward the house, like grasping fingers. Locals say that nothing grows in the shadow of the orphanage, not grass, not flowers, not even weeds. It's as if the earth itself remembers what happened there and refuses to let anything take root. The official records tell a simple story. The orphanage opened its doors to children from across the Northeast, taking in those who had lost everything. The staff was small but dedicated, led by a stern matron named Mrs. Agatha Marrow, whose family had donated the land and much of the funding for the institution. For the first few years, the orphanage operated much like any other. Children arrived, some were adopted, others grew up and left to make their way in the world. But then, in the winter of 1876, something changed. It began with whispers among the children, stories of footsteps in the attic at night, of cold hands brushing their faces as they slept, of voices calling their names from the darkness. At first, the staff dismissed these tales as nightmares, the product of frightened, lonely minds. But then the disappearances began. The first to vanish was a boy named Samuel, just 7 years old. He was quiet, often lost in his own thoughts, but he had a smile that could light up even the gloomiest day. One morning, his bed was found empty, the sheets neatly folded, his few belongings untouched. The staff searched the grounds, the nearby woods, even the river that ran behind the orphanage, but there was no trace of him. The local constable was called, but after a cursory investigation, he concluded that Samuel must have run away. After all, orphans ran away all the time, didn't they? But then it happened again and again. Over the next 6 months, 4 more children disappeared, each one vanishing without a sound, without a struggle, as if they had simply been erased from the world. The staff grew anxious, the children terrified. Mrs. Marrow insisted that the missing children had been adopted by distant relatives or sent to other institutions, but the other children knew better. They whispered to each other at night, huddled together for warmth and comfort, telling stories of the Shadow Man, who came for them when the moon was new. By the spring of 1877, the orphanage was a place of fear. The laughter that had once echoed through the halls was gone, replaced by silence and the constant gnawing sense that something was terribly wrong. The staff began to leave, one by one, unable to bear the oppressive atmosphere. Only Mrs. Marrow remained, her face growing more gaunt and haunted with each passing day. It was around this time that a new figure entered the story, a young doctor named Elias Finch, recently returned from medical school in Boston. He had come to Vermont to care for his ailing mother, but when he heard rumors of the disappearances at Marrow House, his curiosity was piqued. Dr. Finch was a man of science, skeptical of superstition, but he could not ignore the mounting evidence that something unnatural was happening at the orphanage. He visited the orphanage under the pretense of offering free medical examinations to the children. What he found disturbed him deeply. The children were pale, malnourished, and withdrawn, their eyes darting nervously to the corners of the room as if expecting to see something lurking there. When he asked about the missing children, Mrs. Marrow grew defensive, insisting that all was well and that the rumors were nothing more than malicious gossip. But Dr. Finch was not convinced. He began to keep a journal, documenting everything he saw and heard. He interviewed the children, gently coaxing their stories from them. They spoke of cold drafts that seemed to come from nowhere, of doors that opened and closed on their own, of strange symbols carved into the wooden beams of the attic. One girl, barely 6 years old, told him in a trembling voice that she had seen Samuel after he disappeared, standing at the foot of her bed, his eyes black and empty, his mouth open in a silent scream. Dr. Finch's investigation soon drew the attention of the local authorities, who were eager to put an end to the rumors that were tarnishing the town's reputation. A formal inquiry was launched, but it quickly became clear that the records at Marrow House were incomplete, inconsistent, and in some cases, deliberately altered. Adoption papers were missing, names had been crossed out, and dates did not match up. The more they dug, the more questions they found. And then one night in late autumn, Dr. Finch himself vanished. The disappearance of Dr. Elias Finch sent a shockwave through the small Vermont community. For the first time, the townspeople could not dismiss the rumors as childish fantasy or the result of overactive imaginations. Here was a respected man of science, a doctor, who had vanished without a trace after poking too deeply into the secrets of Marrow House. The constable, pressured by the townsfolk and the doctor's grieving mother, organized a search party. They combed the orphanage from attic to cellar, scoured the woods, and even dredged the river. But just as with the missing children, there was no sign of Dr. Finch, no footprints, no blood, not even a scrap of clothing. It was as if the orphanage itself had swallowed him whole. In the weeks that followed, the orphanage became a place of near total isolation. Mrs. Marrow, now the sole adult in the building, locked the doors and refused all visitors. The remaining children, once hopeful for rescue, grew listless and silent. Some began to fall ill, their bodies wasting away as if the very air in the orphanage was poisoned. The townspeople, once sympathetic, now avoided the place entirely. They crossed the street rather than walk past its iron gates, and mothers warned their children never to stray too close. The Marrow House had become a blight on the town, a place of shame and whispered curses. But the story of the Orphanage of Shadows did not end there. In the spring of 1878, a traveling preacher named Reverend Josiah Black arrived in town. He was a tall, gaunt man with piercing eyes and a voice that could silence a room. He claimed to have heard of the orphanage's troubles during his travels and offered his services to the community. At first, the townspeople were wary, but desperation breeds strange alliances. They allowed Reverend Black to visit Marrow House, hoping that perhaps a man of God could succeed where others had failed. Reverend Black's first visit to the orphanage was brief. He emerged pale and shaken, refusing to speak of what he had seen inside. But he returned the next day, and the day after that, each time staying a little longer. He began to hold prayer meetings on the orphanage grounds, inviting the townspeople to join him in asking for divine intervention. Some nights the sound of hymns drifted through the trees, mingling with the cries of the whippoorwills and the rustle of the wind. But the darkness inside Marrow House only seemed to deepen. It was during one of these prayer meetings that a breakthrough occurred. A young boy named Peter, one of the few remaining orphans, approached Reverend Black with a secret. He led the preacher to a hidden door in the cellar, concealed behind a stack of rotting firewood. The door opened onto a narrow staircase that spiraled down into the earth, farther than any basement should go. The air was thick with the smell of damp stone and something else, something sweet and rotten. Reverend Black descended the stairs, lantern in hand, with Peter close behind. At the bottom, they found a small chamber lined with shelves. On the shelves were dozens of small objects, rag dolls, wooden toys, locks of hair tied with ribbon, and, most chilling of all, a row of tiny shoes, each pair carefully labeled with a name and a date. The names matched those of the missing children. In the center of the room stood a crude altar, stained dark with something that might have been blood. Carved into the stone above the altar was a symbol, a twisted looping shape that seemed to writhe and shift in the lantern light. Peter told Reverend Black that Mrs. Marrow came down to the chamber every night, carrying a candle and muttering words in a language he did not understand. Sometimes, he said, she was not alone. Sometimes the shadows moved with her, whispering and laughing in voices that sounded like children, and yet not like children at all. The preacher listened in horror, realizing that the evil in Marrow House was older and deeper than anyone had suspected. Reverend Black confronted Mrs. Marrow the next morning, demanding that she explain the chamber and the rituals. She denied everything, her eyes wild and desperate. But that night, the preacher returned to the cellar, this time with several townspeople in tow. They found the chamber exactly as Peter had described, the altar still sticky with fresh blood. Mrs. Marrow was nowhere to be found. The discovery of the chamber broke the spell that had held the town in thrall. The authorities moved quickly, closing the orphanage and relocating the remaining children to other institutions. The building was boarded up, its windows shattered by stones thrown by angry townsfolk. But the damage had already been done. The story of the Orphanage of Shadows spread far beyond Vermont, whispered in boarding schools and churchyards, told around campfires and in the pages of penny dreadfuls. Yet, for all the horror and outrage, there were still questions that no one could answer. What had happened to the missing children? Where had Mrs. Marrow gone? And what was the true nature of the darkness that had taken root in the orphanage's foundations? Some said it was a curse, others a punishment for sins long forgotten. A few, like Reverend Black, believed it was something far older, a hunger that fed on loneliness and fear, drawn to places where hope had died. Years passed, and the Marrow House fell into ruin. The roof collapsed, the walls crumbled, and the forest crept ever closer, reclaiming the land. But the stories did not fade. Hikers and hunters who ventured too near the ruins reported strange lights flickering in the windows, the sound of children's laughter echoing through the trees, and on moonless nights, the faintest glimpse of a woman in a black dress, wandering the grounds in search of something she had lost. Decades slipped by, and the legend of the Orphanage of Shadows became woven into the fabric of local folklore. Children dared each other to approach the ruins on Halloween, and old-timers swore that the land itself was cursed. But for most, the story was just that. A story, a cautionary tale to keep the curious at bay. Yet, every so often, something would happen to remind the town that the past was not so easily buried. In the autumn of 1923, a group of surveyors arrived in the area, tasked with mapping the land for a new road that would cut through the old Marrow property. The men were professionals, skeptical of ghost stories, but even they could not ignore the strange atmosphere that clung to the ruins. Their instruments malfunctioned, compasses spun wildly, and the air grew inexplicably cold as they approached the crumbling walls. One of the men, a veteran of the Great War, later confessed that he had felt more fear standing in the shadow of the orphanage than he ever had in the trenches of France. On the third day of their survey, the team uncovered something unexpected. Beneath a collapsed section of the orphanage's west wing, they found a hidden room, sealed off from the rest of the building. The door was reinforced with iron bands, and the hinges were rusted shut. It took hours of work to pry it open, and when they finally managed it, a rush of stale, icy air poured out, carrying with it the unmistakable scent of decay. Inside, the room was empty except for a single wooden chair and a small, battered trunk. The chair was child-sized, its paint worn away by years of use. The trunk was locked, but the surveyors, driven by a mix of curiosity and dread, forced it open. Inside, they found a collection of faded photographs, letters, and a leather-bound journal. The photographs showed children, dozens of them standing in neat rows in front of the orphanage, their faces solemn and unsmiling. Some of the children were recognizable from old town records, but others were strangers, their names lost to time. The journal belonged to Mrs. Marrow. Its pages were filled with neat, looping handwriting chronicling the daily life of the orphanage. At first, the entries were mundane, lists of chores, notes about the children's health, complaints about the weather. But as the years went on, the tone shifted. The entries grew darker, more frantic. Mrs. Marrow wrote of sleepless nights, of hearing voices in the walls, of seeing shadows move where there should have been none. She described dreams in which the children called to her from the darkness, their voices twisted by pain and longing. One entry, dated just weeks before the first disappearance, stood out. "I have seen him again, the man in the shadows. He stands at the foot of the stairs watching, always watching. The children say he whispers to them at night, promising to take them away from this place. I have tried to keep them safe, but I fear it is not enough. There's something in this house that hungers, something that will not be denied." The surveyors turned the journal over to the local authorities, who, after much debate, sent it to the State Historical Society. The trunk and its contents were placed in storage, and the room was resealed. The new road was built, skirting the edge of the property, but the ruins of the orphanage were left untouched. No one wanted to disturb whatever still lingered there. But the discovery of the journal reignited interest in the orphanage's dark history. Reporters from Boston and New York descended on the town, eager for a sensational story. Paranormal investigators arrived with cameras and recording equipment, hoping to capture evidence of the supernatural. Some claimed to have seen ghostly figures in the windows, or to have heard the sound of children crying in the night. Others dismissed it all as hysteria, the product of overactive imaginations and the power of suggestion. Yet the stories persisted. In 1931, a group of local boys dared each other to spend the night in the ruins. They brought lanterns, blankets, and enough bravado to mask their fear. As midnight approached, they heard footsteps echoing through the empty halls, and the temperature dropped so suddenly that their breath hung in the air like mist. One of the boys, a skeptic by nature, later admitted that he had felt a hand grip his shoulder in the darkness, a hand that was far too cold and far too small to belong to any of his friends. The boys fled the orphanage before dawn, and none ever returned. Their story spread quickly, adding another layer to the legend. Parents forbade their children from going near the ruins, and the town council considered demolishing what was left of the building. But every attempt to tear it down was met with disaster. Equipment broke, workers fell ill, and once a fire broke out for no apparent reason, consuming the machinery but leaving the orphanage untouched. By the 1950s, the Marrow House was little more than a skeleton of stone and wood, half swallowed by the forest. But the land around it remained barren, as if the earth itself refused to heal. Local farmers reported that their livestock avoided the area, and hunters claimed that no birds ever sang in the trees nearby. The orphanage had become a wound that would not close, a reminder of the children who had vanished and the darkness that had claimed them. And yet, for all the fear and superstition, there were those who could not let the story rest. In 1962, a young woman named Clara Hensley arrived in town, determined to uncover the truth about the Orphanage of Shadows. She was a graduate student in history, drawn to the mystery by the journal of Mrs. Marrow and the rumors that still swirled around the ruins. Clara was methodical, skeptical, and unafraid of ghosts. She believed that every legend had a kernel of truth, and she was determined to find it. Clara Hensley arrived in Vermont with a suitcase full of notebooks, a camera, and a mind sharpened by years of academic rigor. She rented a small room above the town's only diner and spent her days in the local library, poring over faded newspapers, census records, and the scattered remnants of the Marrow House files. The townspeople regarded her with a mix of curiosity and suspicion. Some were eager to share their stories, while others warned her to leave the past alone. But Clara was undeterred. She believed that the truth, no matter how dark, was worth uncovering. Her first visit to the orphanage ruins was on a gray morning in late October. The air was thick with the scent of wet leaves and wood smoke, and the forest pressed close around the crumbling walls. Clara picked her way through the debris, careful not to disturb the moss and lichen that had claimed the stones. She took photographs of the remaining structure, noting the strange symbols carved into the door frames and the way the shadows seemed to pool in the corners, darker than they should have been. Inside, the orphanage was a maze of collapsed ceilings and rotting floorboards. Clara moved cautiously, her flashlight cutting narrow paths through the gloom. In what had once been the dining hall, she found a rusted tin plate and a child's shoe, half buried in the dirt. She knelt to examine it, her breath catching as she realized the shoe was identical to those described in Mrs. Marrow's journal. The name Anna was stitched inside the tongue, the thread faded but still legible. Clara spent hours exploring the ruins, mapping the layout and searching for any sign of the hidden chamber Reverend Black had discovered nearly a century before. She found the entrance in the cellar, just as the old stories described, a narrow door concealed behind a pile of stones. The hinges groaned as she forced it open, and a rush of cold air swept past her, carrying with it the faint scent of something, sweet and rotten. The chamber was smaller than she expected, barely large enough to stand in. The shelves were empty now, the altar covered in dust and cobwebs. But the symbol carved into the stone above the altar was still visible, its lines sharp and unsettling. Clara traced it with her fingers, feeling a chill run through her even, though the air was still. She took photographs, careful to document every detail, then sat on the cold floor and opened her notebook. As she wrote, Clara felt the weight of the orphanage's history pressing down on her. She thought of the children who had vanished, of Mrs. Marrow's desperate attempts to protect them, and of the darkness that seemed to linger in every corner of the building. She wondered if the stories of rituals and shadowy figures were true, or if they were simply the product of fear and grief. But as the light faded and the shadows grew longer, Clara could not shake the feeling that she was being watched. That night, back in her rented room, Clara reviewed her notes and photographs. She compared the symbols she had found to those in Mrs. Marrow's journal, searching for any clue to their meaning. She wrote letters to experts in folklore and symbology, hoping someone might recognize the twisted shape that haunted her thoughts. Days turned into weeks, and Clara's investigation consumed her. She interviewed anyone who would speak to her, descendants of the original townspeople, former staff from the orphanage, even the last surviving child who had lived there before. It closed. One interview stood out above the rest. An elderly woman named Ruth, who had been just 5 years old when the orphanage was shuttered, agreed to meet Clara in her small sunlit kitchen. Ruth's hands trembled as she poured tea, her eyes distant as she recalled her childhood. She remembered the fear that hung over the orphanage, the way the older children whispered about the shadow man, and the cold that seeped into the dormitories at night. She remembered Mrs. Marrow, stern but kind, and the way the matron's face grew more haunted with each disappearance. But what Ruth remembered most vividly was the night she saw Anna, the girl whose shoe Clara had found, standing at the foot of her bed, her eyes wide and empty, her mouth moving in a silent plea. Ruth had tried to call out, but no sound came. The next morning, Anna was gone, and no one ever spoke of her again. Clara left Ruth's house with a heavy heart, her mind racing with questions. She returned to the ruins again and again, searching for answers. Each time she felt the same oppressive presence, the same sense of being watched. She began to dream of the orphanage, of children's voices calling her name, of cold hands reaching for her in the dark. She woke each morning with a sense of dread, but also with a growing determination to finish what she had started. One evening, as Clara sat in the cellar chamber, she heard footsteps above her, soft, hesitant, as if someone was afraid to be heard. She froze, her heart pounding, and listened as the footsteps moved through the ruins, pausing outside the cellar door. For a moment, she considered calling out, but something in the air warned her to stay silent. The footsteps retreated, and Clara waited in the darkness, her breath shallow, until she was sure she was alone. When she finally emerged from the cellar, the sun had set and the forest was alive with the sounds of night. Clara hurried back to town, her mind swirling with fear and excitement. She knew she was close to something, some truth that had eluded everyone else who had tried to unravel the mystery of the Orphanage of Shadows. But she also knew that the closer she came, the more dangerous her search would become. The days grew shorter as November settled over Vermont, and Clara Hensley's investigation took on a feverish intensity. She spent her mornings in the library, her afternoons at the ruins, and her nights poring over her notes, piecing together the fragments of a story that refused to be told. The townspeople watched her with a mixture of pity and apprehension, whispering that she was becoming obsessed, that the orphanage was getting into her head. But Clara pressed on, driven by a sense of responsibility to the children whose voices had been lost to history. One morning, as she sifted through a box of old town records, Clara found a letter that had been misfiled among property deeds. It was dated 1879, a year after the orphanage closed, and was addressed to Reverend Josiah Black. The letter was unsigned, but the handwriting was unmistakably that of Mrs. Marrow. In it, she pleaded for forgiveness, confessing that she had tried to protect the children, but had failed. She wrote of a darkness that had entered the orphanage, a presence that fed on fear and loneliness, and of rituals she had performed in a desperate attempt to banish it. "I have made things worse," she wrote. "The shadows are stronger now. They whisper to me in the night, promising that if I give them what they want, they will leave the others alone." Clara's hands shook as she read the letter. It was the first concrete evidence that Mrs. Marrow had believed in something supernatural, that the stories of rituals and sacrifices were not just rumors. She copied the letter into her notebook and hurried to the ruins, determined to find any physical evidence that might corroborate the matron's confession. The orphanage was colder than usual that day, the air heavy with the promise of snow. Clara moved through the ruins with purpose, retracing her steps to the cellar chamber. She examined the altar, searching for any sign of recent disturbance, but found only dust and cobwebs. Frustrated, she turned her attention to the walls, running her fingers over the rough stone. Near the base of the altar, she found a loose brick. With some effort, she pried it free, revealing a small cavity behind it. Inside the cavity was a bundle wrapped in oilcloth. Clara unwrapped it carefully, revealing a collection of objects: a child's locket, a silver thimble, a lock of hair tied with a blue ribbon, and a small, leather-bound book. The book was a diary, its pages filled with the cramped handwriting of a child. The entries were dated from the winter of 1876, the time of the first disappearances. The writer, a girl named Lila, described the growing fear among the children, the strange noises at night, and the way Mrs. Marrow would disappear for hours, returning with red-rimmed eyes and trembling hands. But it was the final entry that chilled Clara to the bone. "Tonight the shadow man came for Samuel. I saw him standing in the doorway, tall and thin, his face hidden in darkness. Samuel tried to hide, but the shadow man found him. He whispered something, and Samuel followed him into the hall. I wanted to scream, but I couldn't move. I think the shadow man saw me too. I think he's coming back for me." Clara closed the diary, her heart pounding. She felt a sudden urge to leave, to run from the orphanage and never return. But she forced herself to stay, to document everything she had found. She took photographs of the objects, made detailed notes, and carefully rewrapped the bundle before replacing it in the cavity. As she worked, she felt the temperature drop, and the shadows in the corners seemed to grow deeper, more substantial. That night, Clara dreamed of the orphanage. She saw the children huddled together in their beds, their eyes wide with terror, as the shadow man moved through the halls. She saw Mrs. Marrow in the cellar, weeping as she lit candles and whispered prayers in a language Clara did not understand. She saw Lila, clutching her diary, hiding beneath the altar as footsteps echoed above her, and she saw herself, standing in the ruins, surrounded by shadows that pressed closer and closer until she could not breathe. Clara woke before dawn, her skin clammy with sweat. She knew she was in danger, that whatever haunted the orphanage was aware of her presence. But she also knew she could not stop now. She had come too far, uncovered too much. The truth was within her grasp, and she owed it to the children and to herself to see it through. The next day, Clara returned to Ruth's house, hoping the elderly woman might remember something more. Ruth greeted her with a sad smile, her eyes clouded with memories. Clara showed her the diary and the objects she had found, and Ruth's hands trembled as she touched the locket. "That belonged to Anna," she whispered. "She wore it every day. Her mother gave it to her before she died." Ruth closed her eyes, and for a moment, Clara thought she might be lost in the past. But then Ruth spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "We were all so afraid. We knew something was wrong, but we didn't know what to do. Mrs. Marrow tried to protect us, but she was just as scared as we were. The Shadow Man, he wasn't just a story. He was real. And he's still there, waiting. Clara left Ruth's house with a heavy heart, the old woman's words echoing in her mind. The Shadow Man wasn't just a story. He was real. And he's still there, waiting. The line haunted Clara as she walked back through the quiet streets, the late autumn wind rattling the bare branches overhead. She felt the weight of the town's silence, the way people looked away when she passed, as if afraid that her questions might stir up something best left forgotten. That evening, Clara sat in her room, surrounded by her notes, photographs, and the artifacts she had collected. She spread them out on the bed, searching for patterns, connections, anything that might explain what had happened at the orphanage. The symbols carved into the wood and stone, the rituals described in Mrs. Marrow's journal, the children's whispered stories of the Shadow Man, it all pointed to something ancient, something that had taken root in the orphanage long before the first child disappeared. Clara remembered the letter Mrs. Marrow had written to Reverend Black, her desperate confession that the rituals had only made things worse. She wondered what those rituals had been, and whether they had been meant to protect the children or to appease whatever darkness haunted the orphanage. She pored over the diary of Lila, the terrified child who had witnessed Samuel's disappearance, and tried to imagine what it must have been like to live in that place, to feel the presence of something evil lurking just beyond the edge of sight. As the night deepened, Clara's thoughts grew darker. She wondered if the Shadow Man was a ghost, the restless spirit of someone who had died in the orphanage, or if he was something older, a force that fed on fear and suffering. She thought of the altar in the cellar, the strange symbol carved into the stone, and the way the air seemed to grow colder whenever she was near it. She remembered the stories of other places, old houses, abandoned hospitals, forgotten asylums, where similar symbols had been found, always accompanied by tales of disappearances and madness. Unable to sleep, Clara decided to return to the orphanage one last time. She packed her camera, a flashlight, and a small tape recorder, determined to document whatever she found. The moon was high and bright, casting long shadows across the ruined walls as she made her way through the forest. The air was bitterly cold, and the silence was so complete that her footsteps seemed to echo off the trees. Inside the orphanage, the darkness was absolute. Clara moved carefully, her flashlight cutting narrow paths through the gloom. She made her way to the cellar, her heart pounding with each step. The door to the hidden chamber creaked open, and she felt the familiar rush of cold air as she stepped inside. She set up her camera and tape recorder, then sat on the floor, her back against the wall, and waited. For a long time, nothing happened. The only sounds were the distant creak of the building settling and the soft hum of the tape recorder. But as the hours passed, Clara began to feel a change in the air. The temperature dropped, and the shadows in the corners seemed to grow deeper, more substantial. She heard faint whispers, just at the edge of hearing, and the sense of being watched became almost unbearable. Suddenly, the tape recorder clicked off, and the flashlight flickered, then died. Clara was plunged into darkness, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. She fumbled for her phone, but it too was dead. The whispers grew louder, swirling around her like a cold wind. She felt something brush against her arm, a touch that was both icy and electric, sending a jolt of fear through her body. In the darkness, Clara saw shapes moving, shadows that twisted and writhed, forming the outlines of children, their faces, pale and hollow-eyed. They reached for her, their mouths open in silent screams. Behind them, taller and darker than the rest, stood the Shadow Man. His form was indistinct, shifting and flickering like smoke, but his eyes burned with a cold, malevolent light. Clara tried to speak, to call out to the children, but her voice caught in her throat. The Shadow Man stepped forward, and the children shrank back, their faces contorted with terror. He reached for Clara, his hand stretching out like a tendril of darkness. She felt a crushing weight on her chest, as if the air itself had turned to stone. In that moment, Clara remembered the words from Mrs. Marrow's journal. If I give them what they want, they will leave the others alone. She realized that the Shadow Man was not just a ghost, but a force that demanded sacrifice, a hunger that could never be satisfied. The children had been taken one by one to feed the darkness that haunted the orphanage, and now it wanted her. With the last of her strength, Clara reached for the locket she had found in the cellar. She held it out, whispering Anna's name, and the shadows recoiled. The children's faces softened, and for a moment, Clara saw a flicker of hope in their eyes. The Shadow Man hesitated, his form wavering, and the weight on Clara's chest lifted. She felt a surge of warmth, a light that pushed back the darkness, and the children began to fade, their faces peaceful at last. The Shadow Man let out a soundless scream, his form dissolving into the darkness. The chamber grew still, and the cold receded. Clara collapsed to the floor, her body trembling with exhaustion and relief. When Clara finally opened her eyes, the first light of dawn was filtering through the cracks in the orphanage's ruined walls. The air was warmer, the oppressive weight that had filled the cellar now gone. She sat up slowly, her limbs aching, and looked around. The chamber was just as she had left it, dusty, empty, the altar cold and lifeless. The locket still rested in her hand, its silver surface warm to the touch. For the first time since she had begun her investigation, Clara felt a sense of peace settle over her. She gathered her things, her camera and tape recorder still dead, and made her way out of the cellar. The forest outside was alive with birdsong, the first she had heard in weeks. The sun rose over the hills, casting golden light across the ruins, and for a moment the orphanage looked almost beautiful. Just an old building, stripped of its shadows and secrets. Clara stood in the clearing, breathing in the crisp morning air, and let herself believe that the darkness had finally been lifted. Back in town, Clara shared her findings with the local historical society. She presented the artifacts, the diary, and the letter from Mrs. Marrow, along with her own notes and photographs. The townspeople listened in silence as she told the story of the orphanage, of the children who had vanished, and of the darkness that had haunted the place for more than a century. Some wept openly, others sat in stunned silence, but all understood that the truth, however painful, was better than the silence that had festered for so long. The Historical Society decided to preserve the ruins as a memorial, a place where people could come to remember the lost children and reflect on the lessons of the past. A plaque was placed at the entrance bearing the names of the missing and a simple inscription, "In memory of those who were never seen again. May their shadows finally rest." Clara stayed in Vermont for several more weeks, helping to catalog the artifacts and record the stories of those who had lived through the orphanage's darkest days. She visited Ruth often, sharing tea and quiet conversation, and found comfort in the old woman's gentle wisdom. The nightmares that had plagued her began to fade, replaced by dreams of sunlight and laughter, of children running free through fields of wildflowers. But even as peace returned to the town, Clara knew that the story of the Orphanage of Shadows would never truly end. There would always be places where the past lingered, where sorrow and fear left scars that could not be seen. She thought of the other orphanages, the asylums and hospitals, the forgotten corners of the world where children still vanished without a trace. She wondered how many other stories remained untold, how many other shadows waited to be brought into the light. On her last day in Vermont, Clara returned to the ruins one final time. She walked through the empty halls, her footsteps echoing in the silence, and paused in the cellar chamber. She placed the locket on the altar, a final offering to the children who had been lost. As she turned to leave, she felt a gentle breeze brush her cheek, and for a moment, she thought she heard the sound of laughter, soft, joyful, and free. Clara left Vermont with a sense of closure, but also with a new purpose. She dedicated her life to uncovering the forgotten stories of the past, to giving voice to those who had been silenced by fear and neglect. Her work took her to other towns, other ruins, other places where the shadows lingered. Each time she carried with her the memory of the Orphanage of Shadows, a reminder that even in the darkest places there is hope. The story of the Marrow, House Orphanage became a legend, passed down through generations. Parents told their children to stay away from the ruins, but some, like Clara, were drawn to the mystery, determined to understand what had happened. Over time, the forest reclaimed the land, the stones crumbled, and the last traces of the orphanage faded into the earth. But the memory of the children and the courage of those who sought the truth endured. If you've been moved by the story of the Orphanage of Shadows, if you believe that the past should never be forgotten, I invite you to join our community. Subscribe to this channel for more deep dives into history's darkest mysteries, and don't forget to like this video if you found it compelling. Share your thoughts in the comments below. Have you ever visited a place that felt haunted by its past? Do you believe that some places can hold on to sorrow, even after everyone is gone? Your stories and insights help keep these memories alive, and together we can shine a light into the shadows. Thank you for joining me on this journey. Remember, history is not just a collection of dates and names, it's the story of real people, their hopes and fears, their triumphs and tragedies. By remembering them, we honor their lives and ensure that their stories are never lost to the darkness. Until next time, stay curious, stay brave, and never stop searching for the truth.